Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to my new video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Resto Shaman, particularly how to play it in high-end Mythic Plus this season. That being said, this is not a beginner's guide. This is meant to be more of an intermediate to advanced guide for those trying to push keys. We're going to be going over its strengths, the different talent builds and optional talent choices, cooldowns and how to actually use them to time these keys, how to min-max your healing and DPS, how to meet certain hard checks in a lot of these keys and what CDs you'll need to actually do so, and then we'll end with a few weak auras and add-ons that might help you out. As always, if you find the video helpful, like and subscribe. It's completely free on your end, but it means the world to me and it really helps the channel grow. But with all of that aside, let's just dive right into it. All right, so first thing is, let's briefly talk about why you should actually play Resto Shaman. So there's a ton of reasons this season. First and foremost, the utility is insane. With DH kind of losing all the sigils and coming out of the meta, you are the new DH almost in that sense. You have so much utility. You have Cap Totem and Windrush and Thunderstorm and Poison Cleansing Totem and Decurse and Bloodlust, and you have a raid buff now. So you just bring so much to the group that's valuable, and you're going to be handling a lot of these stops and these kicks. You have the best kick in the game. You're going to be handling a lot of these things in keys as Shaman. That's just how it's going to be. So one of the reasons is the massive amount of utility that you bring. Second, you have a ton of healing cooldowns to rotate through, and even when you're outside of healing cooldowns, your healing is pretty strong. You have a lot of throughput as a shaman. In addition to your fantastic healing profile, you have a great DPS profile. Now, you're not the top of the pack, but the only healer that's really outshining the other one significantly is Disc Priest here. Your damage is middle of the pack, but it's very close to all the other healers, even the ones above you. But what makes your damage special is that it's pretty much all passive damage. Your acid rain is going to do about half of your damage. It's pretty nutty. And the fact that that is all passive there is just so valuable. The next reason is Resto Shaman has very simple playstyles and rotations. There aren't a ton of talent like passive interactions and things you need to understand. The healing rotations are pretty straightforward given the situation, and it's just an easy healer, I think, to grasp and really understand. And last, the main reason a lot of you are probably playing Resto Shaman this season is you get invited to keys. Let's just be honest right now, it is a very dominant Resto Shaman meta, and if you're pugging keys, it can be pretty difficult to get in if you're not that class and that spec. So that would be the last reason you get key invites. So now that we've gone over the reasons why you're playing Resto Shaman this season, let's take a look at the different hero talents, Totemic versus Farseer, because both are viable right now, and we'll take a look at the actual talent tree builds and kind of what you'll be taking, what you can swap around, and what it's going to look like. First, let's chat about what I think are the main differences between Farseer versus Totemic, because both are viable right now. You can play both as Resto Shaman, you can time super high keys as both. They both have positives and negatives to them. Farseer is mainly going to be about min-maxing your ancestral window. It's going to have fantastic spot healing and prio damage, and it's going to have a little bit better mana management depending on how you play it. Now let's talk briefly about Totemic. So Totemic is probably what most players are playing. It's what I would advise you play, to be honest, and there's a couple reasons for it. First and foremost, it's just easier. It's just easier. It's pretty straightforward. There's, you don't have that ancestral window to min-max. You don't have to hard cast your healing rain. You get all of these free chain heals off of dropping totems, which frees up a lot of your globals to do DPS and your utility assignments and things like that. It's just a lot easier. Like I mentioned already, it has really great damage potential due to the fact that you don't have to hard cast your healing rain, which does a lot of your damage through acid rain, and then additionally all of the free chain heals that can kind of supplement the spot healing for you when there's not a lot of healing that needs to be done, frees up all your globals to be DPSing. So it has a higher DPS potential I've seen personally. And it has fantastic AoE healing. It is very, very heavily based on that chain heal build, and it just does great at that. It excels at very high AoE throughput. So diving into the Totemic talent tree, for the capstones, what you're going to be taking is going to be Amplification Core, Oversized Totems, Totemic Coordination, and the only one that you're actually going to be playing with is going to be this one down here in the middle bottom, and it's going to be based on what your weapon is. So if you're running a two-handed weapon, you're going to be taking Pulse Capacitator, which increases the healing done by Surging Totem by 25%. If you have a one-hander and a shield equipped, you should be running Supportive Imbuements, which is just going to give you more throughput ultimately than the other capstone. Alright guys, so let's very briefly take a look at Farseer. So again, like I mentioned, I recommend playing Totemic. I think something like 95% of players are playing Totemic, but you can play Farseer. It is still viable, so let's take a quick peek. You're going to be relatively locked in on the hero side of the talent tree. This is what it's going to look like, and it all is playing around those ancestral windows, which we talked about. So basically, every time you use your ancestral swiftness, which replaces your nature swiftness, you're going to have a ancestor aid you, come to your side for 10 seconds and aid you, heal, and do things of that nature. So we really play into that build with Latent Wisdom, which makes our ancestor spells 20% more effective, and things like Heed My Call, which makes them last an additional 4 seconds, which is really, really huge. And then as far as the restoration tree for Farseer, this is what it's going to look like. This is the build that I personally advise that you play. You can swap around a couple different things though. You can take away Echo of the Elements and pick up something like Sprouting Spirits or Earthen Wall Totem if you really wanted to. You could drop Primordial Wave and pick up things like Tidebringer. And really anything. Again, you could pick up Earthen Wall Totem, you could pick up any of these other talents down here. I would probably advise Earthen Wall Totem, or you could go back into Spirits. The point being, if you wanted to play more of a chain heal oriented build, you'd be dropping Primordial Wave and picking up things like Tidebringer. Otherwise, you would be going into that build with Tidal Waters, Primordial Wave, and of course 2 in Ancestral Awakening. And this is the build that's really going to carry you through your keys. Alright, so let's go over the class tree. I'm gonna do my best not to dive into extreme detail here. I'll just say Shaman probably has more flexibility in their class tree than anything else in the game. And what I mean by this is you have so many flexible talents. You could take away things like Primordial Bond and Earth Ellie and pick up Spirit Wolf and Gust of Wind. You, instead of picking up those, could pick up something like Mana Spring and Windrush Totem. You can obviously drop PCT and improve Purify Spirit when you don't need it. You can pick up things like Tremor Totem. There's just so much flexibility that Shaman has right now. Let's say it's a Necrotic Wake. I will sometimes drop Primordial Bond and pick up Tremor Totem just as a safety for the Marauder packs. So there is a ton of flexibility in your tree. Whether you need a Poison Dispel, a Curse Dispel, whether you want extra defensives, extra movement speed, whatever it might be, you have so much flexibility in this tree. You can really make whatever you need happen. And that's another part of what makes Resto Shaman so special and so great this season. You just have an answer for pretty much everything. And you have the flexibility to do so and take what you need. And it feels really, really nice compared to previous seasons on Shaman. Alright, so let's briefly talk about the healing and DPS rotations, how to min-max them a little bit, and the only kind of nuanced things that you need to know. So the only really nuanced things that you need to know is that Riptide is going to proc your Tidal Waves buff. And Tidal Waves, cast time of your next healing wave or chain heal reduced by 36%, critical effect chance of next healing surge increased by 54%. So I think that's just 30 and 50 baseline. But the point is that is what's going to make your chain heals faster. So my normal chain heal is a 2.2 second cast, and with my Tidal Waves buff, it's a 1.4 second cast. Basically allowing me to fit 2 chain heals in almost the time of what a single chain heal would take me. and also for the added benefits that it comes off of your spot healing as well. Moving from there, the next thing that you really need to understand is going to be Deluge. So Healing Wave, Healing Surge, and Chain heal for an additional 15% on targets affected by your Healing Rain or Riptide. So this is bread and butter. First thing you're going to do more or less is just drop your Surging Totem, right? Because this is a ton of healing, a ton of damage, and it gives you that proc. And then you're already casting Riptides for your Tidal Waves buffs. So that is like bread and butter of Shaman right there. It's going to be have that Healing Rain down and make sure that you're getting these Tidal Waves procs to be using for your healing. The only other nuanced thing to really understand is Undulation, where every third Healing Wave or Healing Surge heals for an additional 50%. This is not so substantial that you really need to min-max it or play around it, but it is nice just to know when you have that proc. So I'll get the proc again real quick. You can see it there. There it is. Have it up here as well. And my next Healing Wave or Healing Surge is increased by 50%. From there, the healing rotation is extremely straightforward. It is going to be spam your chain heals for AoE healing and spam Healing Surge basically for the rest of the key when you need spot healing. You can use Healing Waves. It's pretty few and far between when I do, and the main reason that I am using Healing Wave is going to be something like City of Threads third boss, where it's just a lot of mana, and mana management is very important to get through that fight. So realistically, when you're spot healing, especially pack the pack, things like that, you're going to be pressing Healing Surge. For AoE, you're going to be hitting Chain Heal, and for mana management or very non-emergency heals, for single target heals, you can be hitting Healing Wave. And that really is all of Shaman's healing in a nutshell, as far as just like baseline, spot, and AoE healing. The only thing to really mention outside of that is if you are playing Totemic this season, it's going to be crucial that you're reverting to totems and totem healing, like your Healing Tide and the free chain heals you're getting off of your totems, to do the light work that you don't need to, so that you don't need to be casting, so that you can be spamming your chain lightnings or your lava surges or whatever it might be, and the healing can pretty much be handled by your Healing Tide and the chain heals that proc off of your totems that you're dropping. So now let's briefly talk about the DPS rotation. First and foremost, we'll talk about single target, and no matter what, whether it's single target or AoE, you're going to want to have rain down. Not only does it have all of those healing interactions for you, it also just does a ton of passive damage. Even in single target situations, it's going to crank damage for you. From there, you're going to want to make sure that you're keeping Flame Shock up. And then in these single target situations, you will then be filling with Lava Burst and Lightning Bolt when you don't have any Lava Burst or proc. So that is what you'll be doing for single target. Now, when you have 2 to 3 targets, the rotation changes just ever so slightly. Same thing again, you're going to be keeping rain down. You're going to want to keep Flame Shock on all of your targets, but then you're going to be hitting your Chain Lightning, and you're going to be filling those with the procs that you get. So at the end of my Chain Lightning cast, we'll see if I can get a proc here, but at the end of my Chain Lightning cast, you see I'll cast my proc. That way I'm min-maxing my damage. So the DPS rotation when you're in a situation with 4+ targets is extremely simple. You're going to keep rain down and you're going to spam Chain Lightning, and that's all you're going to be hitting. Just Chain Lightning spam and keeping rain down, and that is going to net you a ton of DPS throughput. Now I do want to briefly talk about something. It's what I call spell weaving or something of that nature. You can call it whatever you want, but it's the fact of fitting in these Flame Shocks and these Riptides without just sitting there and hard casting a Riptide or a Flame Shock, right? So you're in this situation, you know, you want to get your Tidal Waves proc and you cast Riptide and there's a global, and that's that, right? And you have to wait to cast anything else. Same thing with Flame Shock. You hit Flame Shock, you're stuck in a global, you can't hit any other buttons. What I advise doing is, let's say you're going into a pull here, whether this be a boss or a pack, whatever it might be, right? So I'm going into the pull. I drop my rain. Here, let me get rid of this proc. Hold on. So I drop my rain. I start casting my Lava Burst, and I finish that cast at the very end of it with a Flame Shock. And the reason is there's a travel time for that Lava Burst to get there, but Flame Shock is instant. So the flame shock applies to the target before the lava burst gets there. I would never go into my opener just hitting flame shock and then starting to cast lava burst. You're going to start hitting that lava burst and then hit that flame shock at the end there. And you can see the flame shock went up and then the lava burst hit right at the end of that. And that's going to be the same thing for Riptide as well. So let's say I'm in a big AoE pull and I'm spamming my chain heal, right? I can hit my Riptide at the end of that. And don't get me wrong, that does cost me a global, but we're talking about the case of min-maxing here, where you need to get a tidal waves proc, you know you're going to have healing soon or whatever it might be. And instead of just hitting that and then starting to hit a chain heal again like you saw there, it's just so much more fluid if you follow up with the Riptide at the end and then go back to your DPS rotation. So, you know, the lava burst with the flame shock at the end. Now I'm in my chain lightning and I'm riptiding someone who just got, you know, injured, and, you know, maybe I drop a totem real quick and I'm back to DPSing. And that's really what you're trying to do here. Is just kind of weave in the abilities that you need to, the crucial abilities. So especially when reapplying the flame shocks, you know, if you're in more than a single target fight, it means I'm hitting chain lightning. So while flame shock's up on that guy and I'm chain lightning, I'm feeling that end of that when flame shock is off CD here with another flame shock on the next enemy. So that's how you're going to be min-maxing a little bit. That way you're not just sitting there casting these single globals. It's just a little bit better value. And my last piece of advice that ties into that has been drilled into my head ever since I started playing WoW. I started off as a mage, and like most casters will tell you, the ABCs of WoW: always be casting. And this really applies to everybody. It doesn't matter what role or class or spec you play. This always applies in keys, in raid, doesn't even matter. You should always be casting. And as a healer, what this means for you is if there's not healing to be done, you are spamming DPS. That is how you're going to bring more value to this key and bring more value to yourself to be brought to these keys. Alright guys, so let's super quickly talk about your healing cooldowns. I assume you already know what cooldowns you have and what they do, so I'm going to talk more situationally about how I use them given the amount of healing that needs to be done. So first and foremost, as far as light healing goes, I'm always going to be reverting to my healing stream totem. It really plays into the entire build and all the free chain heals, and most of the time I'll be using my Totemic recall on healing stream totem to get more back, and that is going to do a lot of your light leg work. From there, I'm going to be using things like my downpour off the healing rain to take care of some AoE healing as well. And if I need something quick for spot healing, I'll use something like Nature Swiftness. Now, back in the day, you used to use Nature Swiftness with something like AG and get a really thick chain lightning and it would top the group, but AG has changed a lot since then, and it's just not quite as powerful. So most of the time I will use Nature Swiftness as a very strong spot heal. From there, if it gets a little bit chunkier and that's just not quite enough to cover it, I'll drop something like my Healing Tide Totem. You could use AG, and that will cover kind of like a light medium damage profile. Now for the absolute heaviest damage profiles in the game, the big healing checks, those are always going to be Ascendance or Link. Realistically, those are your biggest cooldowns, and that is what's going to cover you through a lot. Now, if the healing is really intense and Ascendance just doesn't seem to cover it alone, you can combine Ascendance and AG. They're both on a 2-minute cooldown. I would kind of recommend doing so, as AG by itself is just not very strong, and it has a really nice work with Ascendance. Everything kind of rolls into each other and duplicates. That times effect that all your healing gets just gets amplified, and it becomes a very, very massive cooldown. And my last tip for healing cooldowns is do not underestimate the use of Healing Stream Totem, specifically with Totemic Recall. There have been plenty of times where I'm dry, I don't have any of my other cooldowns, but I do have my 2 charges because I sat on it, I got ready, you know, to use it. I have my 2 charges, I drop them, I Totemic Recall, I 3rd Healing Stream Totem, I cast a couple chain heals, and it gets us through a massive damage pattern that something like Ascendance would get me through. It's a little bit dicier, but it will get you through it, so don't underestimate that. And if you're really out of everything and you know you're just not going to have the healing, but you notice you have Totemic Recall, that's a time where you could start pooling those healing streams, pop that with Recall, and really get a large amount of healing out. So one of the last things I want to go over is some of the harder healing checks that I've met throughout the Mythic Plus dungeons this season, and how I've overcome them and how you can too. So the first key I want to talk about is going to be City of Threads. I have found City of Threads probably to be the most difficult key to heal pretty much on any healer, but especially on Shaman. So we'll go over a couple of the more dangerous parts. So the first thing I want to talk about is the big mini boss before you start to enter into that third boss hallway, right? The hallway with the last couple bosses in it. That mini boss does a cast that puts a poison dot on your entire group, and that dot really hurts. Now, at the same time as this dot, there are a bunch of swirlies on the ground that you have to dodge. And everybody knows that casting on Shaman can be a bit difficult on the move unless you have Spirit Walker's Grace. So what you can do to overcome this that's really easy actually is you can simply use your Poison Cleansing Totem to remove all of these debuffs, and then you can use Totemic Recall to get another Poison Cleansing Totem for the second cast that goes out, and usually the ad is dead by then. Next, we'll talk about the second boss in Court of Stars. So there's a mechanic that goes out the ice arrows, and it does a massive amount of damage, and it's at the same time that you have to get out of some pools on the ground and some other things, and it's quite difficult to heal. So first and foremost, I definitely advise having your Link or Ascendance for that, but some tech for this dungeon actually is that you can combine things like your Windrush Totem and Jet Stream. And it sounds weird, but because it removes snares, which this ice arrow technically is, it works as a mass dispel on the entire group. Now, right after these ice arrows go out, the dance goes out from the bosses, so there's a ton of dodging to do too. So keeping your group top, especially without Spirit Walker's Grace and a bunch of dots, is very difficult actually in Resto Shaman. So a way you can cheese that is by picking up this Jet Stream talent, and every time those ice arrows go out, you would drop your Windrush and it will cleanse the group, and it's very useful. And last for Court of Stars, let's talk about the third boss. That boss is a lot of healing. It's very mana intensive, so I do advise using your small cooldowns, your healing stream and healing waves and things like that to get you through the absorbs. But when it comes to the Dark Pulse does an incredible amount of damage. But even in super high keys, you should kill the boss before you get a third Dark Pulse. So I recommend having Link and Ascendance to ping pong between those Dark Pulses. Whether you use Link first or Ascendance first doesn't really matter. I advise Link because it's a longer CD, so you get it back sooner for when you need it next. But you're going to use one of those cooldowns to really get you through that Dark Pulse. It is quite difficult. So we'll very quickly talk about Miss. I think the last boss can be a little bit difficult for Resto Shaman, simply because there's a lot of dodging you have to do during the shield phase where it does its big AoE on the group, and there's pools in the ground and the big swirlies, and it can be a little bit difficult. So what I found is easiest for it is actually doing a double or triple healing stream with Healing Tide to get through one of them, which does in fact work. It works quite well. So I use my Totemic Recall to get back an extra healing stream totem. And then for the second AoE phase, I will have Spirit Walker's Grace and Ascendance. And you can swap those around either way. The point is, for the phase that you have Spirit Walkers, you have your big healing, you can be in Ascendance and be casting heals, and then for the phase where you don't have so much healing on the move, you can revert to things like your Healing Tide and all your healing stream totems and your small cooldowns. We'll briefly talk about Arakara. For the first boss, the Shrill is what's going to do all the damage. For the movement, again, you can Spirit Walker's Grace 1 and cast through the healing that's needed on the group, and then you won't have it for the next. So for that, I recommend having a couple healing stream totems handy or Totemic Recall to call one back, and you can pretty much get through that and a Nature Swiftness if anyone does get kind of low, and then you're just going to rotate back and forth between those two things. For the last boss, everybody knows, again, it does a group-wide poison dot, and that dot does hurt. So what you're going to want to be using, obviously, for that is Poison Cleansing Totem. But what you can do is use Totemic Recall to get that totem back. So instead of just having it for every other one, there's a lot of times where you can fill that gap with the Totemic Recall. That being said, you need to wait a second or two to drop it because it will instantly dispel someone, and if they're in melee, you run the risk of just wiping the key. So make sure that you do wait a second or two before you drop your totem. The first boss in Necrotic Wake, the maggots really hurt. I'm sure you guys have noticed, and if you have any melee in the group and a tank that's not cutting the boss away, there's not a whole ton they can do. But what you can do as a shaman every single time is you will have both your Earthbind and your Cap Totem for each set of adds. So you should be dropping those to slow them, to stun them, and then hopefully the group will be able to kill them in time before they become too much of a nuisance. Again, for Necrotic Wake, you have Narzuda, as a mini boss that you fight, and all of its healing can be negated entirely by just running Purge. And you're going to purge the shield that he puts on himself, and then all the healing is negated. There's no terrible overlap anymore. People stop dying. It's much better. And the last key we'll talk about is just Grim Batol. Very simply, the lava benders do a lot of damage. There are only a couple of them that you're going to have to pull, but you are going to need either Link or Ascendance, and realistically probably Ascendance, to get through that. It could be potentially both depending on the group. All I'm saying is when you go into those lava bender pulls, ensure that you have your big healing cooldown because you're going to need it. Now let's super briefly touch on weak ores and add-ons. I'm not going to jump into a ton here, but I will advise as far as an add-on goes, you should always have Omni CD for keys. It is so crucial. It is so nice being able to track everyone's abilities, damage, CC, just everything. It is very critical when you're trying to push high keys, and that is something you're going to want to have. And for Resto Shamans out there this season, I highly advise the Luxros weak aura pack for shamans that he has out. So it will cover all the specs. It's really fantastic. If you find there are a lot of things you don't want, as you see in my UI, I only kept a couple. You can delete the things you don't want, pull out the things you do want entirely, whatever you want to do. You can customize it yourself fully, but it is a really fantastic resource. So I highly advise that you download that. That is, however, going to wrap us up for today, though, guys. I appreciate your guys' time. I appreciate you watching. Again, like and subscribe. It really helps.